Welcome back to the studio and to Media Storm, the podcast that starts with the people who are normally asked last.
Today we're talking about temporary accommodation, social housing, and how these issues are represented in the media.
Joining us is a very special guest. He is a 24-year-old social issues campaigner and leading the charge for meaningful housing reform. He's also the presenter of Channel 4's Untold episode, Help, My Home is Disgusting, taking on social housing tenants and private renters' calls for help. Welcome to the podcast, Kwajo Tweneboa.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. In the first half of this episode, we heard from people with lived experience about temporary accommodation and also got their expertise on what they think the solutions are to the problem. Could you tell us a bit about your lived experience, about how you got into campaigning for social housing reform?
Yeah, so I mean, I've experienced, me and my family, temporary accommodation firsthand. Ours was absolutely horrific. I mean, we were in essentially a converted car garage that had been poorly knocked together. I was sharing a room with my sisters. We had a shower, toilet that was the size of literally a broom cupboard. The place was infested with ants. We had damp and mould in the bedrooms, growing onto the bed, in the, I say wardrobe, it wasn't even a wardrobe. It was just absolutely appalling. It's more like a building site. And then after that, we moved into, which is now my home, our social housing that we finally got in the end. My dad finally got, but again, we moved into poor conditions. We had disrepair galore. We had issues with mice, cockroaches, damp, mould. We had a kitchen that was nearly 100 years old. We had a bathroom which wasn't fit for use. It had no windows in there, and the light was filled with rainwater every time that it rained. It was described as not fit for even animals to be living in when a workman did finally show up to do some work. But that's the sort of conditions that we were in. And again, the reason I'm here today is because we had been complaining. My dad became ill in those conditions and passed away in January 2020 from his cancer that he had, but whilst being treated in those conditions. And the reason I'm here today is because we were simply ignored before and after he passed away. And it got to a point where I had enough, so I turned to social media and the news to shame my landlord into carrying out necessary works, not just for myself and my estate, but for neighbouring estates too in my area. And since then, gone up and down the country speaking to residents in situations like me and my family were in. I was in my final year studying for sixth form, so my A-levels, and my sister was doing her GCSE. That was it was hard.
So you guys were revising in the same room as well?
Yeah, literally we did. I mean, there was no furniture. I remember there was no furniture in there. We had this old wooden chair that was in there. We had two old wooden chairs, and I put in like the small kitchen area. And I remember doing my English essays, writing that for hours during the night because I was catching up and I was so last minute. But just thinking like, this is actually mad.
Yeah. And even after moving out of the temporary accommodation and then into social housing, that social housing was not fit for purpose.
No, it was from the get-go. We moved into disrepair.
And then not only you guys expected to live your daily lives, but then your father was ill and expected to live in those conditions. And that's what fueled you.
Yeah, I mean, the fact he was at the point, even now, actually, I know I do this work, but it can't help the fact that you feel guilty for your own parent being in those conditions. Even though you didn't really have much power, there's not much that you could do. I still very much feel guilty that he was in those conditions, because even when district nurses were coming in and saying this is really bad, he was having to basically try and fight for his life, battling with cancer, whilst in those conditions. And he was obviously the priority at the time. But even looking back, the fact that at a time when you most need to be looked after and the support and to be listened to when you're essentially dying, he wasn't. And for the majority of his life, he worked looking after the elderly. He was a carer himself. So at the time that he needed to be looked after, he wasn't. And that's, what makes me very angry about the whole situation. And since then, I've come across various families where individuals they've reached out to me because they've got stage 4 terminal cancer, for example, in some cases, and they're living in like lung cancer in one case and living in a home filled with damp and mould, been complaining, made their housing provider aware that they have got cancer, they are dying, and they do nothing. They don't help them. And I mean, from my own story and hearing those stories, there's similarities there. And that's what really angers me, how you can just sit back in a place of work, a profession, when you know you're supposed to be looking after some of the country's most vulnerable individuals like that. And someone is telling you they are dying, they know they're dying, but they want to die comfortably and they don't want to be living in those sorts of conditions. Yet they're simply ignored even at that point in time. It's less about it being a job and more about where's your moral values.
It's so much for a teenage boy to have to take on, and the fact that then it actually took you pressuring and shaming your landlord for any action to be taken really shows what a state of crisis we're in. But I'd love you just to help us define some of the terms that we're going to be using a lot today, so listeners just are on the same page. One of the terms you see all the time in media discussions around this is the housing crisis. So it's important to define what exactly that is.
It's really hard to define the housing crisis, actually, because there's so many elements to it. In regards to the work that I spoke about in the beginning, it was social housing and the poor conditions people are living in, the fact we don't have enough social housing, the fact that we've got 1.4 million people waiting to get into social housing. And as a result, those waiting are essentially homeless and in temporary accommodation, having to sofa surf, etc. But then on the other side, you also have the private rented sector where rents are at some of the highest levels we've ever seen. People are struggling to pay their rents and as a result are being evicted. Section 21, no fault evictions being used and going through the roof. The fact we don't have enough homes being built. And then on top of that, also you see with mortgages and what we've seen in the last year with interest rates and the way in which that's affected mortgages, that's affected those with mortgages, but also it's affected private renters too, because that cost has been pushed down onto them. Yeah. So it's made an already difficult subject even worse. And this housing crisis isn't one that's been built in the last year. It's something that's developed for the last 70 years plus. I remember only a few weeks ago, I watched a show called Kathy Come Home, and it's really, really good about a family that was privately renting, fell on hard times, then depended on social housing. There wasn't any. It was so poor quality. And
when was this series?
It was 60s, so it came out in the 1960s, right? And the scariest part was I watched it and thought this is exactly what is happening to people now.
Okay, so when do you think we can trace the current housing crisis back to?
I often say the last 40 years, but even from that, it's much longer than that. It's much longer than that. I wouldn't be surprised 100 years plus. And we know in the Victorian days how people were living in slum housing. You had sewage flooding people's homes. You had workhouses and all of those sorts of things.
So is it getting worse, or is it just a chronic systemic problem that we've failed to address?
I think it's a mixture of both. Housing has not been seen as a priority in this country. I mean, I've been alive, 24 years, and I can't really remember housing being made a priority or the number one priority at any general election in my time anyway. I don't know, housing was very much pushed in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, and obviously the introduction of Right to Buy, which was extended under David Cameron in 2016. But yes, housing at that point was seen as a priority, but I think for all the wrong reasons. And things were done there that only exacerbated the problems that we're seeing now in social housing, in housing in general. And for me, the priority within housing in general is the number one priority, I think, and the biggest crisis at the moment is social housing. And the reason I say that is because, like I said, 1.4 million people waiting. We've got Right to Buy. There was 1 year we actually knocked down and sold off more social homes that we actually built in that year.
Oh my God.
And if we're to fix the housing crisis with that many people waiting on the social housing waiting list, we cannot be doing that. But the fact is, it is. And we're in 2023 at the moment. We could easily make it a priority. We could easily start by fixing some of these problems. But I think at a political level, the sort of ideology around housing is completely wrong. We don't in this country see housing as a necessity like they do in places like Germany or Vienna, for example, and they've done really well with their social housing. What we see it as is an investment. We see housing for home ownership and the idea of home ownership only and we see it as an asset. We're pushed to believe that we should acquire a home for financial wealth and to have an asset, instead of thinking about, well, actually, Maslow's hierarchy of needs states we all need shelter in order to function correctly.
I mean, it's so true what you're saying. If
Yeah.
you just look at the language that we use for housing, and we use it in the media as if this is objective, factual language, it's not. It's got such a narrative behind it. And you just use the term shelter to describe housing. I have a background in humanitarian aid. We would talk about shelter as the basis level of need that has to be met in a time of crisis. Yet in our society, we don't see housing as shelter. We don't see it as the basis level of need. We see it as property. You know, all of the language that I associate with property growing up, oh, you've got to get on the property ladder, or you're part of the renter economy. This defines housing in my mind as a commodity. And yeah, if that's what it comes down to, then we need to rethink our whole ideology if we're going to come anywhere close to addressing this problem.
That's absolutely, and I've said at the next general election, that's what they need to do, political parties. They need to stop seeing housing as an asset like they have done for the last few decades, and that's why we've not progressed in this country with housing. That's why we're not building enough and pushing people to own their own home, rather than thinking about the large group in society who are either private renters or in social housing, and we're just completely neglecting them. But what we're seeing is, even in this lead up, and it's a sort of, obviously we're in the early days of the lead up to the next general election, we're seeing both parties pushing this narrative of home ownership, when for the last 2 years you've had news agencies out there showing the slum conditions. You had myself and other campaigners, Shelter, Grenfell United, you've had others out there showing the disgraceful conditions inhumane conditions people are having to live in. Yet we're still pushing this idea of home ownership off of the back of a global pandemic and a cost of living crisis that I've never seen before, where people are even struggling to feed their kids and pay their rent, pay their bills, their heating, their electricity, never mind have any slight chance to save up in order to get onto a property ladder. I think what they need to start doing is using common sense if they're really going to tackle this housing crisis, and not what they think's just going to win them an election. Because what's going to win them an election is doing what people really care about and what's affecting them most. And that's being able to pay their bills. That's being able to pay their rent and not worrying about their huge increase in rent, having shelter over their head, having a social housing property. These are the things people care about. And you cannot fix a housing crisis without fixing the foundations first. And you start with social housing when you're doing that, and you work your way up. If they're able to fix social housing and sort of provide that safety net for people, for British society, then what they can do then, and we get the waiting list down from 1.4 million, that's going to massively increase productivity in this country, labour efficiency. People aren't going to have to be worrying about their mental health and taking time off of work and all of these sort of external sort of factors. And from then, you could move on to the private rented sector, or you could do them sort of coordinated. You could talk about the way in which we should be regulating rents now, because it's becoming absolutely ridiculous. People just cannot manage it, and as a result, they're becoming homeless. We need to be looking at the amount of homes we have available for private rent, because obviously we've got the likes of Airbnb and other holiday lets where we're seeing landlords switch over to Airbnb because you're able to make more money, and they're more holiday lets. And as a result, people are being driven out of those sorts of areas.
I mean, that shows the way that you know, that politicians prioritize what they're going to do in their manifestos. I mean, I feel like the idea is, we promote growth and we target businesses, and that new revenue and wealth is going to trickle down, and then basic issues around housing will be addressed. What we don't do is start, and what I'm hearing you say is we need to start from the bottom up. I mean, at the very least, just making sure people have a roof over their head and can eat and can feed their kids. And that's not the way we do it.
Then you can talk about, if you can fix that and the private rented sector and levels of private rent and how much people are having to pay, then common sense would say people would actually have the opportunity to save up in order to get onto the property ladder. But sitting here and telling the general public that they're going to one day be able to own their own home, when the reality is the majority
how many
is
of
not.
us actually believe we're ever going to be on the property ladder?
But actually, I want to talk a little bit more about that kind of dream of home ownership, because you mentioned right to buy. Could you just quickly tell us what right to buy was? It was a Thatcher policy, right?
Yeah, it was. It was introduced in the 1980s. I want to say said 1983. That might be wrong though, but it was introduced under Margaret Thatcher, basically allowing those who were in council housing to purchase their home at a discounted rate, which on the surface to people back then would have sounded absolutely great. And I've spoken to people who took advantage of that back then, or their parents did, who now turn around and say it was probably the biggest mistake for social housing. I would completely agree.
And why is that?
The reason is because there was a promise made back then that council homes would be sold off, but they would also be replaced, and they would build back council homes so that we didn't find ourselves in a situation or crisis like we have now. Since then, that's just not been the case, not just by the Conservative government, but by Labour governments too. Consecutive governments up until this point have not built enough homes. And when I say enough homes, I also mean enough quality homes. But what we've been doing is continuing to sell the homes that we do have in the dwindling stock off. And then obviously on top of that, we had the introduction of housing associations, and 2016, the introduction of right to buy. Under housing associations, so housing association properties then being sold off, and at that point we was already struggling. And now what we found is the waiting lists are growing for social homes, and in some years we're selling off more homes, or selling off and demolishing more social homes than we're actually building. What that's meant now is we've now got 131,000 homeless kids in England alone. We've got record levels of homelessness and people in temporary accommodation, and we've got people struggling in the private sector, having to switch to social housing when there isn't enough, and we don't have enough.
What was interesting about Thatcher's right to buy, though, is that it was often surrounded by really positive language and billed as this like hugely aspirational policy that would allow people who may not have been able to buy their home. And I was wondering if that language had changed, but we did a quick headline search, and even as recently as last year, there were articles about the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson wanting to reignite Thatcher's right to buy policy. I mean, this from the Daily Mail as an example reads, tenants who are on benefits will be offered new packages to help them buy their own homes as Boris Johnson rekindles Thatcher's right to buy revolution. Revolution. I mean, and I wonder, does the media still portray right to buy as that ambitious policy, or does the media in any way hold that policy to account for the crisis it helped to create?
I definitely think the media, especially in the last few years with the developments in housing and the stories that have come out, especially since Grenfell, have begun to realise this idea of right to buy is flawed, and it's making the situation a lot worse. But I don't think just the media too, the general public, because there was this whole push under Margaret Thatcher's right to buy scheme and David Cameron, where they were turning round, and anyone that questioned the idea of right to buy or criticised it, they'd turn around and say, so do you think working class individuals shouldn't be able to own their own home? Is that what you're saying? When that's not the case. What people are worried about is that we would find ourselves in a situation that we had. Because yes, on the surface, it's like dangling a gold carrot in front of your face and say, take it, look how amazing this is. And then in reality, it's the complete opposite. Because what they were saying is, you can own your own home. Why take advantage of it? We'll give you a discount and have it. What they didn't tell people was that they weren't going to build and replace those homes, and that in 30, 40 years from then, there are going to be people just like you, working class individuals, who would be homeless, and in some cases for 10 to 15 years even, I've spoken to, in temporary accommodation, poor quality temporary accommodation or social housing, who are struggling like no other, genuinely really, really suffering. They kept that bit out. But what they were very good at is pushing this notion that working class people need to own their own home, which I think is great to aspire to. But what they didn't admit was that the right to buy scheme was completely flawed and was actually going to make the social housing crisis a lot worse. And that's what it's done.
The term right to buy is about as meaningful as the term take back control.
Yeah.
It's a political slogan, not an accurate name of a policy. And if the media just kind of regurgitates it, it's really failing to be critical. Another term that I think we would really benefit from defining is affordable housing. I see this term affordable housing referred to always as the kind of solution in these discussions, and I'm like, well, people can afford different things, so what actually is genuine affordability. Can you tell us what we mean and what we should mean by that term? Because I don't think the media is very good at establishing it.
I've told them I've met with politicians and told them to get rid of this term because it means absolutely nothing. Like, the term is hollow in itself. It's not another one of those terms that sound nice on the ear, but when you actually look at its substance, there isn't anything there. Because what do you mean affordable housing, affordable homes? Because what's affordable to me is going to be unaffordable for the next person, and what's affordable for someone in the House of Commons is going to be it's going to be unaffordable, completely unaffordable to me. So this whole idea of affordable housing is very open to interpretation, but the term itself sounds good on the ear and really satisfies what it is people want to hear, and it's a very political term, and I know why, I get why they use it, but it means absolutely nothing. It means absolutely nothing to the everyday person.
And anyone can say it. I guess you could just say, oh yeah, we're increasing the production of building of affordable housing. Yeah. But if that's a relative term, what does that even mean? You're not saying anything.
Exactly. It's very, very a vague, open to interpretation term. And what really annoys me about it too is because we see a lot of developments happen now, right? Where they say, this is a development scheme, we're going to build 3,000 affordable homes. And you then go and ask them, so how much of that, we've got 1.4 million people waiting on the social housing waiting list, how much of it's going to be for social housing? And you think affordable housing, yeah, surely it's going to be social a decent housing, amount. Yeah. Then you're told it's 2% of what's built.
Affordability should be, I suppose, relative to income. How much of our incomes could we reasonably be expecting to spend on rent? Because at the moment, I'm spending the majority of my income on rent. I don't know that that's technically affordable, but, you know.
No, exactly. And we're seeing that across the board. Yeah. In London and in other places of the country, we've seen rents shoot up by as much as 20% in some places. And this term affordable, like you said, if someone's paying the majority of their monthly income on rent, that isn't affordable, but still it's defined as affordable housing. So that's why I completely want the term gone. If they need to be clear about what it is they're offering us. How much social housing are you going to build? When you say affordable housing, what do you mean by that? That term should just go. You should break it down and make it clear what it is people are paying for, so people can criticize and scrutinize it and actually make a sort of valid judgment based on what it is that you're saying. But it's one of those blanket terms that is used to sound good.
There's almost a bit of helplessness, I feel like. I feel like a lot of the general public just kind of assume that this housing crisis that we're living in, it's just the way things are in the UK, and they're just going to have to pay the majority of their income on their rent, and that's just the way things are. And I don't feel like the media necessarily do anything to stop that negative portrayal. You know, we've tackled some media myths and social narratives about housing, so I think we should also talk about some of the myths and narratives that come up about the type of people that live in social housing and how the media portray them. Through your work, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about the type of people that live in social housing?
When a lot of people think of social housing, they just think of Benefit Street, I'll be honest, and I think it's one of the worst shows created, and I have criticised it in the past before.
This is a Channel 4?
It was, yeah, it was. Yeah. It's not shown anymore, but it was created on Channel 4. But it was almost like, I don't know how to describe it. I can't remember how I described it before, but Benefit Street is almost entertainment out of, or off of the back of poorer people in society. Television entertainment for that. And I think around that time, that narrative was hugely pushed, and we already had a negative stigma when it came to, we have done since social housing sort of existed. We've always had a negative stigma about those who live in social housing, and I think that made the situation a whole lot worse. You had people saying, well, why don't they just get off, people in social housing, they can get off their backside and go out and work and get a job like the rest of us, stop scrounging on benefits and expecting us to pay for it through our taxes. You lot should be grateful for what you have. You're getting discounted rent as it is. Those are the sorts of things people would say, quite ignorant comments without actually knowing what it's like in real life. And traveling around the country, I realized it couldn't be anything but the opposite to that portrayal of social housing tenants. And I wanted sort of through my work to prove that too. Because when I was a social housing tenant and living in disrepair and our landlords weren't listening to us, in my head I just thought, they're probably thinking, oh, what does this guy know? He's living in social housing. What does his family know? They can do what they're told. At the end of the day, we're an organisation, and they must bow down to us, sort of thing. And they probably had a sort of thought about what I was like, what my family was like, what people are like in social housing. And it's that looking down attitude that they've had for a very, very long time that I wanted to prove isn't and cannot wash with absolutely everyone living in social housing. And that's what I encourage other social housing tenants to do. And I think why it's come on so much in the last 2 years.
You know, yeah, you mentioned Benefit Street. That was a Channel 4 documentary made roughly about 10 years ago, which followed the lives of several people in Birmingham who lived on, and they quote, one of Britain's most benefit dependent streets. What's interesting is that actually since the show, a few of the people who were on the show say that Channel 4 didn't give them adequate aftercare and they weren't prepared for the force of negative stereotypes and trolls and everything that came their way. Important to say that has been disputed by Channel 4, and Love Productions, who made the show, have previously denied allegations that the show was poverty porn.
That's the word I was going to use, because that's exactly what it is. That is exactly how I see it. And it was created almost created to create entertainment out of poverty. I mean, what else? What is their explanation for it? I don't get it. You've got people living in council housing on one of the most benefit dependent streets in the country. Why else are you going to create a show following the lives of those individuals
which makes you wonder how that show was sold to the people who took part in it.
Yeah.
Because who's going to take part in a show that is described?
You're poor, you're on benefits, and we want to follow you around and film your lives and for entertainment for the rest of the country.
And actually, I do have a stat here from the English Housing Survey data, which actually shows that just 7% of social housing tenants are unemployed and 70% are working or retired. And that is completely in antithesis to what is portrayed in the media, in pop culture. I mean, from what we were talking about before, to me, it does seem like a very convenient political tool for the government and politicians to stigmatize those in social housing, to stigmatize those residents, and I think that's why the media are possibly so disinterested in positive stories about social housing residents, because the government is I was going to say the government is disinterested. Actually, no, I think it's scarier than that. I think the government are actively allowing that stereotype to continue because it is convenient for them to paint people who live in social housing as nasty people, so that they don't seem like the nasty people. Yeah,
but what a stereotype. If only 7% of people in social housing are actually unemployed, that isn't, that isn't the stereotype grounded in
bad people either.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that statistic alone, I often say to people, they come out with the most sort of ridiculous comments and statements about those living in social housing. And all you have to do is open Google and search for yourself for these facts, and you'll actually find out what the actual and real statistics are. And it's completely opposite to what people's, or the stereotypical sort of council social housing tenant is. And absolutely you're right. What is wrong with someone that is unemployed? People are unemployed for various different reasons and dependent on benefits, whether that be disability, mental health, you name it. There's several different reasons, but there's this assumption that everyone in social housing is scrounging off the government and taxpayers' money, that they get discounted rents, that they don't go out and work, they're sat on their arse day in, day out, basically 24/7 doing nothing. And it's something that's perpetuated by social housing landlords too. And it's very, if you weren't paying attention or looking into it in detail, it's very nuanced. But their repairs team, and when they're supposed to come out and do repairs, right, what they do sometimes, they don't even ring you. They'll just show up and knock on your door and expect you to be in. Don't think you have a job. Don't think you'd have any other commitments, or you might be out for God knows what reason, and sometimes they show up on the wrong days. And if you don't answer your front door, they turn around and say you refuse them access to the property to carry out the works. But someone might have a job. There are loads of people that work 5 days a week, have jobs, and have to sort of try and work around that. But when they're getting cancelled appointments, or people are showing up on the wrong days or not showing up at all and then saying they've refused them entry, it goes to show that the stereotype in their mind is, what else are social housing tenants going to be doing other than waiting in for us to come and carry out the repairs? Surely they just sit at home doing nothing. They don't work. They don't have a job. They just scrounge off benefits, probably watching TV. Why aren't they in? So they must be refusing us entry to the property to fix it. And those are the sorts of undertones that you see within social housing that just highlight that perception of social housing tenants isn't just from people outside of social housing, but those within that work for social housing too. It's a cultural thing.
So I want to ask about how we can bridge the gap when we are reporting on the social housing crisis and trying to draw attention to it. A lot of the imagery could be very, humiliating to show like the squalid conditions in which people are being forced to live. How do we shine a light on what people are going through without feeding this economy of poverty porn? And one of the sentences you said that you didn't quite finish was these are the stereotypes, but when I went around the country meeting these people, that is not my experience. Could you just tell us a little bit about the people that you did meet and the narratives and the impressions of people in social housing that you think we should be putting out as an alternative to poverty porn?
I've been out meeting so many different families from a variety of different backgrounds, ethnicities, you name it. I've met people, professionals, solicitors, doctors, nurses, teachers, key workers living in social housing, carers. I've met people from all different walks of life, working in the prison system, social worker, people that work in housing, people that work for news media and broadcasters, from a variety of different backgrounds living in social housing that you probably wouldn't, if you went by the stereotype, wouldn't think do live in social housing, with loads of different stories to tell. But the reason they come to me is because they've been fundamentally ignored and living in squalid conditions and not listened to. And the sort of level of learning that I've received from them, you couldn't do studying the subject of social housing. I've picked up so much in the last 2 years from the people that I meet. And they do often work really, really hard, but are or have been born into a life where they're dependent on social housing and just treated so appallingly. And people really, really suffer, especially living in disrepair mentally, and with the stigma if they do speak out. They feel like they're going to be blamed. That's the automatic assumption, is that it's their fault. They're the reason why they're living in the way that they are. And it just, for me, couldn't be further from the truth. And I was determined to show that actually there's a very different narrative and story in reality. And through my work, although it is shocking and disgraceful, some of the things I have to highlight, standing in people's homes flooded with raw sewage. I mean, people's ceilings caving in, taking people to A&E because the ceilings caved in on top of them. Cockroaches, mice, you name it, those conditions. Although I have to show the extent to how bad it is, I want to, because I think it's very, very important to highlight what it is that these individuals, human beings, are being subject to in the 6th richest economy in the world, but by also telling their story too. And the fact that in these situations, they are the victim. They don't want to live like this. They're being forced to. And they are paying rent at the end of every month to live like this. When in reality, the duty of care lies with their housing provider, but they're not fulfilling their legal obligations. And that's where shame comes into it and why it's been so important. But I think we should never, ever try and soften the reality or make it look nicer than what it is when it comes to how people are having to live, especially in social housing, from working class backgrounds. We should never try and soften that or cover it up. People need to see the reality in order to try and push for change, systemic change. But what we also need to be doing is showing and telling the stories of those behind and on the other side of the camera, those actually having to live in those conditions, because that too will take away from that stereotype that's existed for so long, and you will realize these are actually your everyday people that you walk past, that you work with, that you see on a daily basis, that actually have a life and have a story to tell, that work hard, but because they are in social housing and from a working class background, they are treated the way that they are. There's been people that work in social housing too that I've helped, and they live in social housing but have lived in disrepair and treated exactly the same when they've dedicated so much of their time and lives to actually work in social housing themselves.
Yeah. You mentioned public shaming and naming and shaming landlords, and you know, a lot of the stereotypes that occur about social housing residents have come up through social media, but I imagine that social media was instrumental in your work. How were you using it to name and shame?
Social media was the absolute key for me. I have no doubt that if I didn't have that, I would not, as a campaigner, be here today doing what I'm doing. It was the key for me. And there's this negative stereotype with social media, and it can be a very toxic place at times. But what that work does is show that actually you can use social media for change. And it was the key for me, because I could have chosen any traditional way of campaigning and trying to get the issue out there. But I think with social media, it was the quickest way for me to do so and the most efficient way for me to do so. And it spread to all four corners of the country in a way that if I was traditionally campaigning, I might not have received that sort of level of reach. And not just this country, but abroad too. Millions of people viewing those posts, but also having an opinion. And the vast majority of people were absolutely shocked and horrified at what it was that they were seeing. In some cases, couldn't believe it was happening. In others, people were then feeling comfortable to come forward and say, you know what, actually, we're living like that. And this is what the reality of social housing is. And what that did was started a conversation on a platform where you have journalists and you have politicians, where it's impossible for them to ignore it. It started a conversation front and centre there, and then we're forced to respond.
I mean, you got picked up on this and have gone very quickly to becoming some sort of like figurehead. How is it being put on TV panels and live news? Have you found that to be okay, or have you been put in debates and situations that are just completely unreasonable?
No, it's been great overall. I mean, I have to say, for me anyway, in my situation, as well as having social media, the media has been great too, and news in terms of covering stories and keeping it front and centre. I mean, I started off with ITV News and Daniel Hewitt and his team, and they were talking about the same sorts of issues that I'm talking about now. That's been great, but there's been other subjects on housing where I have done panels and I've just thought, like, I can't believe I'm actually debating this. I can't believe this actually has to be debated. Why am I debating the fact that people should be living in sheltered accommodation where the ceiling isn't going to cave in on top of them? Why is that debatable?
Yeah.
Why isn't that just the norm?
I actually believe it's a human right.
Exactly.
In our human rights.
Thank you.
Charters.
Why is it that is debatable? It shouldn't be. But I think on the grand scheme of things, a lot of people agree with what it is that I'm saying I've campaigned on. And my bottom line is, if I'm sat opposite anyone and I'm highlighting these conditions and they're trying to debate it, I will just ask them, would you live in those conditions? If the answer is no, then there is no excuse and there's no argument here as to why anyone, regardless of race, regardless of background, regardless of class, why anyone should be subject to those conditions. And I think that's the basis that I'd win that argument on. But you do have one or two people that will always come out and try and debate and say, well, actually, it's not like that, who have done in the past no actual research into what it's like for people living in these conditions or spoken to anyone, but based on their own beliefs, want to push another sort of narrative. It's very interesting at times.
Interesting. Yeah, I can imagine. Can you give us any specifics?
Just even
was it Good Morning Britain?
No. They've been actually really great. They have been really. I actually really enjoy going on Good Morning Good Morning Britain talking about these individual cases, and they have done a lot to cover it, but it's mainly on like social media where you've got individuals that crawl out of the woodwork and have a lot to say. When statistics are there, facts are there, just go and do a Google search. But it's very interesting in the sense that I'm very passionate about this subject, and sometimes I have to sort of rein myself in, and I had to like control myself in certain situations and not respond, and I'm just thinking this is just pure ignorance.
Honestly.
And it's very difficult because back a few years ago I would have very much been the person to respond, and I didn't care who it was. I'd argue till I was blue in the face. But those that really understand this issue and know it for what it is, knows that what's happening is completely wrong, and we are in a crisis that has to change.